Wayne, it's estimated that 40 to 50% of what we would call first marriages end in divorce. And second marriages, unfortunately, has an even higher rate at 60 to 67% of a divorce rate. And certainly what you and I know in our world right now, divorce rates are for a wide variety of reasons. Irreconcilable differences, we just fell out of love, we had all these things happen. And so there was a movement back in the 2000s, early, all the way up to around 2015, I think was at its peak, where a site that was specializing in trying to encourage people that life was short, so have an affair. And they would take that mentality and promote, hey, it's okay. Marriages, one man actually who worked for that company said, this, I believe, made marriages stronger. And several people who worked for the company, when they were interviewed about their role in this company, made the same statements of, well, when we would have a wife call the company asking why there was a charge that didn't make any sense on their credit card, we would lie to her, and the entire time we're lying, we're thinking, just save somebody's marriage. Adultery is what we're talking about here. The word affair makes it sound a little cuter, makes it sound a little less, there's business affairs, there's other things, personal affairs that happen. An affair does not carry, in my opinion, the same weight as the word adultery.
Sure.
Adultery has a punch to it. It certainly makes people stop and go, oh, he committed adultery? Not just he had an affair, he committed adultery? And so as we think about this, some people want to justify, having an affair or committing adultery. What would you do if someone says, well, I'm in a loveless marriage, so adultery is acceptable in that case, right?
Yeah. A loveless marriage, and you hear terms like that, I think, in more recent years, and it's interesting because talking to older couples who have even, still been married 40, 50 years and stuff like that, sometimes we'll talk about, there's just not been any real, it just seems like a loveless marriage. But when they start describing certain things within the marriage, you soon find out, no, there was full support of one another always. There was a protection of one another always. There was there was love. It just didn't seem to have the flair maybe that someone else's marriage might have had.
Yeah.
And so it may have seemed loveless. And but regardless, a loveless marriage is certainly, it would be difficult. It's unfortunate. And it likely, if it's truly a loveless marriage, it then has some other sinful actions that are involved. And so I'm going to begin in Ephesians 5 because it talks about what that relationship is supposed to look like.
Right.
And then let's answer the question. So starts off in Ephesians 5:22, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. The husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. He's the Savior of the body. Therefore, as Christ or the church is subject to Christ, let wives be to their own husbands in everything. And then verse 25 says, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. And so there to begin with, husbands are told, love your wives. Wives are told, submit to your husbands. And then in verse 33, nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife. He says it again, closes out that section. But the last part of that verse, let the wife see that she reverences or respects her husband. There is to be an awe of her husband, but that is only in that proper relationship when there is love and there is submission. Then these things are present. That's what a marriage is supposed to look like and to be. Obviously, it is between two parties that are capable of being married in the eyes of God. And so a loveless marriage certainly could be the cause of even causing one to run to the arms of another.
Yeah.
Not just have a quote, whitewashed affair, but what it truly is, adultery.
Right.
And so that does not make it acceptable.
Yeah.
That never makes it acceptable. You read Matthew 5:32. I say, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except fornication causes her to commit adultery. So there is the possibility of the actions of the other party causing one to run to the arms of another. This, obviously, he puts it here, putting her away
Right.
for any reason other than fornication. But that could also, you could include in that, certainly a loveless relationship could cause. Now, does that make it right? It could push someone in that direction, but they still have the choice
Right.
to commit or not commit adultery. And so that does not clear the guilty party who ran to the arms of another, even though their spouse was not acting as they should.
Right. And when you think about what verse 29 says, no one ever hated his own flesh,
Right, yes.
but nourishes and cherishes it just as the Lord does the church. What Paul's writing there is there's not a man out there that hates himself.
Right.
And adultery is selfish. It causes someone to think of themselves greater than their partner and spouse, and someone that is supposed to be their teammate, their helpmeet, the person that they spend the rest of their life with. And we think about adultery for what it truly is. It is saying, I don't care about this other person more than I care about myself.
Right.
And what Ephesians 5 tells me is that's the opposite of how a marital life is supposed to look. I'm supposed to look at my wife as Christ looked at the church. And the value that he placed on the church was one that he said, I'll die for it.
Right.
And yet today we have some husbands who we pledge our lives to our spouses, but then we have husbands that say basically, yeah, but things have changed since then, kind of like terms and conditions, they needed to be updated, and we didn't update them, we didn't keep them intact. This is easier. And sometimes, unfortunately, things that happen with this is, well, my wife doesn't look like she did, or my husband doesn't look like he did when we got married 10, 15, 20 years ago. And this person is attractive to me, and this person is attracted to me. And there's been popularizing of this, I guess is the way I should say it. In 2018, I think it was Taylor Swift and I think their Sugarland maybe was the name, where they wrote a song and sang it called Babe. And that song is about a woman finding out her husband is having an affair with his secretary and committing adultery. And the song chorus says, how could you do this to me, babe? How could this happen? We're not making through this one. We're not going to get through this. And sometimes people would say, but it's just not the same as it is, 10 years ago as it was. Loveless marriages, I would say, as you kind of alluded to as well, start and end with, what do I put into it?
Right.
Am I putting in the type of love on my part that I'm supposed to? Because we often look at the wives be subject to the husbands or submit to the husbands. And some people say, see, that's really, bad language.
One-sided.
Yes.
Yeah.
But what is supposed to be understood is this is not a dictatorship. I'm not the dictator of the household that says, we're doing this whether you like it or not. It's a partnership. I am the head of the house. I'm supposed to be in that role. But I don't just unilaterally make decisions and treat my wife as if she's just along for the ride.
Yeah.
We work together. And when husbands grasp that understanding of working together and loving each other, then it is easier for the wife to submit to the man that's like that. If the husband has that mentality of, you're going to like this or, take a hike,
Right.
then we got a problem.
Yeah.
And she won't want to submit to him. And that can cause some problems as well in the idea of that loveless mentality. It's what you're putting into it that makes a big difference.
Yeah. And I would add to that thought, we've used the illustration sometimes when we are either counseling, kind of giving biblical counseling for marriage, both on the premarital side, but especially, marital counseling, dealing with those who are in a relationship and it feels loveless and they're like, there's a complaint, what can I do? My husband just doesn't respond to me anymore, doesn't love me anymore, and so forth. There's been the illustration given before about, okay, what are you doing, in that relationship to help kind of promote that love, encourage that kind of love? Well, nothing really, because I'm just in my mind, I'm already separated from him, and
Right.
okay, well, if you go back, you spend the next 30 days, every day, you do something to encourage him. You do something specific to show him that you love him. And you put everything into it. Even if he's doing nothing, you put everything into it. And let's talk in 30 days and let's see what changes, if anything. Let's
Right.
talk again. And so often it is the case, he's looking at me differently now. He's spending some more time with me. He's talking to me now. And so again, sometimes it has to be. There are ups and downs in marriages, and there are times when a situation needs to be, I need to put in more effort on my end because I know they're going through some things. Or maybe I don't know if they're going through some things in their mind, but I'm going to put the extra effort in. Why? Because marriage is worth it.
Right.
And that's what the Lord wants for us. We've committed to this thing, and so sometimes that means I'm going to have to put the extra effort in.
And you think about the way that this starts is often with the eyes.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
People look at someone, they find an attraction to them, maybe they spark up a conversation, they realize, hey, we've got things in common. And certainly you cannot get away from friends that are of the opposite sex. That's going to exist. Now, there need to be some boundaries and need to be some careful considerations in that. You cannot just say, well, he's just my friend, and so we're going to go to dinner by ourselves in a place where no one knows us, and we're not going to be out in public. Or she's just my friend, so we're going out to eat, and no one will know that we're there, and no one will know who we are. I know sometimes our jobs will require us to work with people of the opposite sex. We know of a good brother who does his own television program and has said that some of his producers have been women, some of them have been men. Well, you have to work with those people, but there have to be boundaries that are clearly defined and understood. When you enter into a working relationship or into a friendship with a woman or a man, as the case may be for any of us, the intent has to remain pure.
There has to be boundaries.
There has to be a boundary set that says this is where we don't go.
Yeah.
Ever. There's not even a time to entertain the thought.
Right.
And that brings me to what unfortunately has kind of been taken and asked. What would you do if somebody says that pornography is adultery, the exact same as the physical act of adultery?
Well, we've done an episode on pornography itself, but just with safe search on and specific words used, and you search, okay, why is pornography sinful or something like that, and what is a general search, kind of looking at some of those terms, not obviously the images and things like that, but thinking about, okay, why is it sinful, will lead to some sites that are helpful. Covenant Eyes will give you some good articles and things like that, but there's some things that will help you thinking about statistics, okay, but what you begin to find is articles that will tell you'll hear stories of why pornography is sinful, but what I also found in that is that most religious writers that are dealing with this subject completely take this as the exact same as the act of adultery. And so there's a reason why most people in their mind directly associate watching something and doing something to be the same thing.
Right.
And so I'm trying to choose my words right, but that's and so you have to define the term porneia. That is the term King James uses, the American Standard uses as fornication. Some other translations, sexual immorality,
right.
And it is sexual immorality.
Right.
Either of those, when you're talking to somebody, you have to define what that is, even in the English.
Right.
So I don't have really a problem between the terms necessarily that are used there, because whether I'm talking about the old King James language or the word sexual immorality, you're having to explain this is the actual sexual act, a sexual contact. if you will, with another person. So, and pornography falls into the category of sexual fantasy brought on by visual lust. And in that particular program, we were talking about the lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15. These things, and verse 16, these things obviously are not of the Father. They're of the world. They are those things that actually cause and lead to, that's the temptation that is set before a man or a woman to look on another. And whether it's in a looking at a computer screen, TV monitor, whatever the case may be, or looking at another individual in that way, those things, the eyes and the flesh, war against the soul, is what Peter says. And so there is a separation, because we have to understand that the word fornication, the word sexual, defined as sexual immorality or translated sexual immorality in most modern translations, is not the same. There is a difference. And so we're talking about, literally, porneia is the illicit genital sexual contact.
Yeah.
And so that's what Matthew 19 is talking about.
Right.
So,
well, and you think about, some people might say, well, what about Matthew 5? When Jesus said, whoever looks on a woman, in verse 28, to lust for her, has already committed adultery with her in his heart.
Yeah.
Well, there's a quote that I think that is prudent to read. I'm not endorsing everything this man teaches, but this is David Guzik, who wrote the following. It is important to understand that Jesus is not saying that the act of adultery and adultery in the heart are the same thing. More than a few people have been deceived on this point and say, well, I've already committed adultery in my heart, may as well do it in practice. The act of adultery is far worse than adultery in the heart. Jesus' point is not to say that they are the same things, but to say that they are both a sin and both prohibited by the command against adultery. Some people, he says down here, has a principle where it says it applies even more so than just men looking at women. It applies to just about anything we can covet with the eye or mind. These are the most searching words concerning impurity that were ever uttered. And one other thing that he quoted in here is, imagination is a God-given gift. But if it is fed dirt by the eye, it will be dirty. All sin, not the least sexual sin, begins with the imagination. Therefore, what feeds the imagination is of maximum importance in the pursuit of kingdom righteousness. We need to make sure people understand, noticing a beautiful woman and stumbling, I would say, has happened to many men. There's only one man that I know that never happened to, and that was Jesus.
Sure.
Tempted in all points. But see, that's the thing. Jesus was also tempted with the ability to lust after somebody. Because if he's tempted in all points as man is tempted, yet without sin, lust had to be a part of those temptations. Well, Jesus was able to say, I'm not going to do that.
Right.
But if the teaching here is genuinely saying, hey, this means if you look at a woman and lust after her, you have committed adultery.
Right.
Well, then we have a problem that many men have to be put away right now.
Yeah.
And that's that's not to say that, that they are absolved from what they've done. That's still a sin, lusting after a woman and looking at her in inappropriate ways, or a woman looking after a man in an inappropriate way is still sinful. But it is to understand this, what you mentioned, it's the physical contact that Jesus was discussing here. Because we said this with David. The sin of David would have been lesser had David simply looked at her, lusted, and then said, oh, I shouldn't do this, go back into his home and say, Lord, I'm sorry, I'm repenting, and I'm never going to do that again. None of what followed would have happened.
Right.
But what ended up happening was because of the physical act of adultery that David, was involved in committing. Let alone, if we take verse 28 as literal, why don't we take verses 29 and 30 as literal too?
Yeah. Pluck out
because
your
if
eye.
your right eye offends you, plug it out.
Right.
If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off.
Yeah.
I've never heard anybody that promotes Matthew 5:27 and 28 as proving pornography would be cause for divorce,
Right.
to then say, and they have to cut off their hands and pluck out their eyes too. They understand that sometimes a figurative language is being used. Figuratively speaking, Jesus says in 29 and 30, cut your hand and eyes out if you need to.
Right.
What he says in verse 28 is, if you look at a woman and you entertain the thought, on a regular basis, in the figurative sense of it's possible, maybe, hey, I'd like it if it were true. What happens if she offers herself to you?
Right.
If Joseph
You've set yourself
every day,
up for a fall. Yeah.
If Joseph every day looks at Potiphar's wife, which, just a side note, isn't it interesting that the only name we have for her is in the possessive sense, that she belongs to Potiphar.
Yeah.
She's no one else's but his, and every day she's trying to get Joseph to commit adultery and to have this problem, this sinful act of what would be for him fornication, but for her adultery. Well, if Joseph every day thought, oh man, she's beautiful, she's exactly what I would want in a woman, she's everything I could ever hope for, I mean, man, what would it be like if we were together? And then she says to him, lie with me. Joseph's already set himself up for failure to say, hey, I wouldn't mind doing that. I would love nothing more than to do that. Jesus is saying, guard your heart, because as what was said by Guzik, all sin begins with imagination. And if I'm imagining having an affair, I'm going to have a much more difficult time to say no to that. But there's another thing that some people will say, and let me make sure this is said too before I move on. This is not to condone the sin of pornography either.
No, absolutely not.
We've done an episode on this. We've talked about it. We've condemned it. The Bible condemns it. This is just simply to say we've got to be careful that we call a spade,
right,
and that we're honest about what the Scriptures truly teach.
Both sinful.
Yes, because this is one of those things. Do you really want to risk that you've put away somebody and remarried and you could be wrong? Is that really what you want to play around with and gamble on your spiritual salvation? I don't think that would be something I'd want to do personally. But there's another thing that people will sometimes say. Wayne, what would you do if someone says that really only Matthew 19:9 teaches this, but later Paul would come around and say that, well, there's a certain privilege that we'll give that will bypass this teaching?
Well, Matthew 19:9 clearly says, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for fornication and marries another committeth adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced or put away commits adultery. And then obviously in 1 Corinthians 7 would be what some have called the Pauline privilege, so as to say, well, Paul taught something else. And so I'm going to base my marriage role or my divorce on the Pauline privilege, and so forth. The problem is that context means everything, you know. And did Paul teach something else? No, he was dealing with a specific thing. Whereas, by the way, Jesus was too. Yeah. And so, but what you find Jesus teaching is the same thing that God had set forth in the beginning. And nothing Paul says goes against that. And so you have to keep those things in mind. Here are a couple of thoughts, and I've got some notes that I'm pulling up from Brother Scott Kane and one of the lectures that he had done. I think this was from the Power Lectureship. And so I just got a couple quick notes and everything just to kind of add to the conversation here. This comes from the idea of not under bondage, really from 1 Corinthians 7, verse 15. But this is part of that conversation. The words not under bondage mean that a Christian is no longer bound to the marriage and free to remarry. That's the position that some take, this Pauline privilege. And so that's this is an ungodly view of what Paul is actually saying. Under bondage indicates an enslavement, if you will, and so Paul will later use the term deo or deo in the Greek term there about the marriage bond, but the word used earlier in the chapter is a different word. And so ultimately what it means is we're talking about the context of Christians married to non-Christians to begin with in 1 Corinthians 7:15, and the context sets up basically an ultimatum talking about either leave Christ or I'm leaving you. And in that situation, Paul says, well, let the unbeliever depart, because you're not so bound to them as to unbind yourself from Christ.
Right.
That's never the case. And that is the context, that is the discussion that is actually taking place in there. And so marriage is never described as a slavery in that way. But we are slaves or servants to Christ. There is a different bound or bond that is there. And so there's no Christian that is so bound to their spouse so as to have to give up God.
Right.
That is never the case. That's the context. That's what's being talked about. And what's interesting is in this whole conversation, there are situations, and you have to think about, there are Matthew 19, verse 12. There are some eunuchs which were born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. There are some situations where a spouse departs. There's no, Jesus is explaining, there's some that are going to have to be eunuchs for the kingdom's sake. In other words, abstaining from a sexual relationship because the marriage bond has been broken, because their spouse departed, left them, because they are now Christians, and therefore they're going to have to just stay in that, because it wasn't for fornication.
Right.
So Paul did not give some extra, here's a loophole, here's a way around all of this, and so that you can remarry. That's something that man has tried to add in here, and it's just not found in this text in 1 Corinthians chapter 7.
And not just that, but Paul was an apostle inspired by the Holy Spirit, who we're told in John 14:26, the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name. Jesus is speaking here. He will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all things that I said to you. All the things that need to be taught, Jesus is saying, I can't stay and the Spirit come. One of us has to go.
Yeah.
Well, the Spirit's going to tell you what you need to know and guide you into all truth, which would be from Jesus Christ, meaning this wouldn't be a Pauline privilege. It would be a Christ privilege, but that would contradict then what Jesus said in Matthew 19:9. So we have a problem even on that assumption alone. It just is unfortunate that sometimes people simply want to make it go that way. But Wayne, thanks for being here today and talking with me. And thank you. Welcome to the new version of What Would You Do If? If you've been watching us in the past, we have a new set now at the Memphis School of Preaching Studios. We're a part of the Scattered Abroad Network. We're thankful for the opportunity that we have to sit down with you each Saturday and discuss different questions and trying to give you the answers that are from the Bible. Next week, we look forward to being back with another Bible answer to everyday questions.